Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be in our community. As we enter our second year of the global COVID-19 pandemic, with record numbers of both cases and deaths, our schools, businesses, and governments are still struggling to deal with the health, economic, mental, and societal impacts of the latest Omicron variant. This all adds to the ongoing uncertainty of our ever-changing indoor and outdoor, vaccinated and unvaccinated protocols, and the politics of the pandemic that will drive how we all come back together as a unified or fractured community. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality.
And now the federal agency is actually forgiving people on the loans. It has been a really problematic program in the past under different administrations. I'll just put it that way, where there's been this promise of real forgiveness, and then very few student borrowers have actually gotten their loans forgiven.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Eric Estrada, the associate producer of Voices of the Community. George is continuing to recover from ear surgery, so I'm your host again for today's episode on the status of our nonprofits. We know from our interview in January 2021 with Jacob Harold and Anna Koob of Candid that from their extensive study, they estimate that over 4,000 nonprofits in California could go out of business from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. This conversation led us to wonder what the status and health of nonprofits were in California, and in turn, our interview in May 2021 with Lucy Salcido Carter and Christina Dragonetti with Cal Nonprofits to share with us their work to support nonprofits. Given all of the federal and state funding flowing through the state of California legislature and governor's offices, we wanted to check back in with Lucy Salcido Carter to update us on all of their public policy work to assure that our nonprofits secure funding and resources to enable them to both stabilize and recover stronger as we come out of the pandemic economy.
With the state of California's budgeting process in full swing, we wanted to check back with Lucy Salcido Carter at Cal Nonprofits. This episode is focused on the policy and legislative work of Cal Nonprofits and its impact on our nonprofits and their operations, as well as their governmental, philanthropic, and individual support. I'm joined remotely by the Public Policy Director, Lucy Salcido Carter, at Cal Nonprofits. Welcome to Voices of the Community, Lucy.
Thanks, George. Good to be here.
It's great to see you again, and I really wanted to reach back out to you because I'm on your newsletter, and for folks who are listening to this, please check into episode 61 where Lucy was also featured, and we did a really great background piece on Cal Nonprofits last year. But I was reading all the things that you are working on in both federal, state policy and how that flows through nonprofits. So I think for the audience who are just tuning in, please just provide a quick overview of Cal Nonprofits and its policy work, and then we can dive into more of that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, there is a lot going on, that is for sure. So first of all, I just want to let folks know that we are a policy alliance of more than 10,000 members. So we're like a chamber of commerce for California's nonprofits. You could think about us that way. We like to advocate for policies that protect and enhance the ability of nonprofits to serve our communities. And we focus on issues that affect the sector as a whole. So we don't get into subsector issues. We don't take a stand on environmental issues or arts issues per se, or health, human services. We really look at the issues that affect the sector as a whole. And sometimes they aren't maybe the sexiest issues in the world. I've learned a lot about tax policy and policy areas that I hadn't before, but they do have a big impact on the sector. So it's important for us to be engaged in them. Cal Nonprofits is a key advocate, and we've been a key advocate through the pandemic, and will continue to be. And we play a unique role in that other nonprofits are much more focused on whatever policy issues are relevant to their specific missions. But our mission is focused on the sector. We're in a unique position to represent the sector at the state level, at the federal level. We don't do local advocacy, but we do support others doing local advocacy and encourage nonprofits to be engaged at the city and county level as well, especially with a lot of federal funding coming down to local governments. It's really important now. And I can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I wanted to let people know that we have a policy framework that we use as the basis for our policy work and deciding which efforts we'll support and take the initiative on, and which ones we'll leave to others to lead on. So we want to strengthen nonprofit access to public funding. We know that nonprofit funding, about 30% of it comes from government contracting. So our partnership with government is really important. We want to strengthen that partnership whenever we can. We also support increased civic engagement. We support nonprofits being independent, but also held accountable. We like to support policies that strengthen the nonprofit workforce. And we generally support policies that represent the broad values of the sector. So that's just to ground people in what the foundation of our policy work is. We publish e-alerts on a range of policy topics, and I'll talk later about how you can get on our mailing list. We'd love to have you on our mailing list. We do a lot of webinars on what I'll call compliance topics, legal do's and don'ts, but we also do webinars on a range of policy topics. We partner with organizations like Public Council. We also have a partnership with the Northern California Grantmakers, Southern California Grantmakers, and Philanthropy California, and the League of California Community Foundations. And we do 3 or 4 public forum webinars on policy issues with them. So that gives you a picture. Just to give you an example of one of the webinars that we've done recently and that tackled a very salient issue. I think it was in February. We partnered with Student Borrower Protection Center, the U.S. Department of Education, and a new student borrower ombudsperson at the state level, and I'll say a little bit more about that, to do a webinar on the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program and the waiver that is in place right now. We had over 3,000 registrants for that webinar, and we had 1,500 people actually attend the webinar live. So that's an example of how Cal Nonprofits tries to be responsive to the needs of the sector. When there are policy issues that come up, we will make sure that we cover them. So I think that gives you, one more thing I wanted to say is that we are very well connected in Sacramento. And so government leaders come to us when there are policy issues that they know will have an impact on the sector so that we can advocate on behalf of the sector. And we also reach out to them to work with them on a range of policy topics. So I think that's good for background.
Yep, that's a very nice background piece. So let's turn to all of the policy and legislation you've been working on, your teams have been working on really in 21, 22. And I think, and just you and I put together this great list, but the first ever joint hearing of the State Assembly and the Senate Select Committees on the nonprofit sector. So perhaps start there and then go into federal and state, and then we can go into a little more granular.
Okay. If it's okay, George, I wanted to take a step back and just talk a little bit about what some of the key issues were that came up at the beginning of the pandemic.
That would be great.
Okay, great. So throughout the pandemic, we have worked very hard to be responsive to the policy needs of the sector. And 2 issues came up right away. One was that the sector was going to need relief. like small businesses and other industries, nonprofits were going to need relief. The second one was that nonprofits were responding very flexibly to the need of communities and needed to have contract flexibility too in order to be able to respond to those needs. So those were two critical pieces that from the very beginning Cal Nonprofits was pushing for: relief for the sector and contract flexibility so that we could be as responsive as possible to our communities while they were dealing with the pandemic. We were very involved in making sure that nonprofits were included in the California Small Business COVID-19 Relief Grant Program, which began right at the tail end of 2020 and then continued through most of 2021. We worked really closely with our legislative allies to make sure that nonprofits were included in that program. The very beginning of the idea for the program, they were not. And that's been a really important piece of relief for the sector. And we had great legislative allies advocating with us to say nonprofits have to be included. Nonprofits are small businesses. They are struggling. We need to support them. We were one of the partners in helping the administrators of the program to make sure that nonprofits had good access to the program. It was really designed as something to help small businesses. It wasn't tailored to the needs of nonprofit grant applicants originally. And we weren't able to get all of the changes that we wanted to that program, but we were able to get many of the changes that we needed in order to make it easier for nonprofits to apply. So I wanted to make sure to mention that. And the other effort that I wanted to mention is that we developed a letter, and hundreds of nonprofits signed on to this letter. We also worked with the chairs of the select committees, and I'll talk more about the select committees in a minute, for legislators to sign a letter as well, asking the administration to provide contract flexibility for nonprofits. We were not successful in getting the kind of relief that we wanted on that particular policy issue, although I think we elevated the issue. We had many conversations with people in the governor's office about it, and they're now aware that this is an ongoing issue. We did then partner last year with Senator Glazer on a Senate bill, and that's Senate Bill 784, that would have legislated that contract flexibility. So we worked first with the administration and then secondly with the legislature to try to make it happen through the law. That bill is being held right now because we learned that the governor was going to veto it. And I bring up these efforts because they're ongoing and because we really need your listeners and other people who are part of the nonprofit sector to engage with us. We haven't given up on the contracting issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute, but we can use more support on that. And then two more bills that I want to mention that we worked on last year. One is Senate Bill 543, which would bring a liaison to every state agency, a nonprofit liaison to every state agency that interacts significantly with the nonprofit sector. Small businesses have this already in place in state agencies, and we thought it was really important for that in-house expertise on the nonprofit sector to also be available. Working on that state COVID-19 relief grant program made us realize that a lot of state agencies have interacted with small businesses but don't really understand how to tailor programs to the nonprofit sector. We are small businesses, but we don't operate exactly like for-profit businesses. There are some significant differences. That bill is in the assembly right now. It's still alive, and we may use it for a vehicle to do some contracting legislation. Then just one more that I wanted to mention before we dig into 2022. We partnered with the Attorney General's office. They were the official sponsors of AB 488, which was Assembly member. I wanted to mention also that Senate Bill 543 was Senator Limon, who was one of our select committee chairs. I wanted to make sure to thank her for her authorship of that bill. And then Assembly Bill 488 was it was passed into law. So we were successful. And it's a bit of a David and Goliath story because it further regulates online charitable giving. And a lot of the online platforms are run by very big tech companies, and they had a lot of concerns about what kind of regulations were going to come in and possibly restrict their activities. But we really wanted regulations because we wanted to make sure that donors trust the process, that donors feel comfortable using online platforms to give money to charities. We want to make sure that can happen, that they have access to the information they need. So one of the things in the bill is disclosures around fees so that there are no hidden fees when people are giving money. They know how much money is going to the charity and they know how much is going to the platform. So that's included in the bill. We also wanted to make sure that nonprofits' names were not going to be used for online solicitations without the nonprofit knowing about it. And we also wanted to make sure that charities get those donations promptly, that they're not held by the platforms indefinitely. So that's also in the bill, and there's some regulations that will fine-tune how the bill gets implemented. But that was a big coup and something that we were really happy to work very closely with the AG's office. And it was interesting just to be in these big stakeholder Zoom meetings with much more highly paid attorneys representing the tech companies. But we were successful and we're really proud of that. So I wanted to highlight that.
That was really a great overview of all the work the whole team's done over literally almost the last 2 years. I want to circle back because I feel like one of the most interesting things coming out of the COVID-19's impact on nonprofits is they finally changed the model that they were considered to be businesses. So first time ever in history, a nonprofit was able to actually apply to the Small Business Administration for grant funds. So if you could, because that's ongoing, and I have a feeling, and we can talk more about it, that also ties into more money coming from the feds, hopefully to help support nonprofits.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm really glad you're mentioning the Paycheck Protection Program because we did several webinars with the SBA and on this, and we had thousands of people participating in it. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And yes, it's amazing that nonprofits were included in that. And they were also able to access the EIDL loan program if they wanted to, the Economic Injury and Disaster Loan Program. And there was a special interest rate for nonprofits to take out loans through that program. And I just heard the SBA just announced that they're extending the deadline to start paying back on that loan. And nonprofits don't access loans the way they access forgivable loans. What was so great about the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, was that it is a forgivable loan program. So it's like getting a grant. So that was really important. And we were really happy to get to partner with the SBA on sharing information about the PPP so that many California nonprofits could apply for it and get that relief.
And many nonprofits I've talked to over our series in the last 2 years, and we're now working at episode 90, is so many of them were able to stay alive because of the nonprofit PPP loan/grant program, the forgivable loan program. So I think I'm really hoping, and with all of your work, helps change the federal and state model for helping fund, especially the small nonprofits, because there's thousands of small nonprofits that are out there and we're barely staying alive, especially the performing arts organizations, because 90% of them all shut down.
Absolutely. And we have worked really closely with our arts organization allies around making sure that support for those organizations happen through the small business grant program. They had a special allocation of funds and rounds just for arts and cultural nonprofits. And there's some money left over from that. It was $50 million originally. There's about $20 million left over. And we've been working with our arts partners this year to make sure that money stays designated for arts and cultural institutions, that it doesn't get put back into the pool of general funding for grants. So, and I think we've been successful so far. One other federal thing that I wanted to mention that came up last year that isn't on our list, but I think is really important because nonprofits can still get relief through this program, even though it ended third quarter of last year. That is the employee retention tax credit. So and I don't know a lot of the details about it, but I just want to mention it because if nonprofits have not accessed it and they think they might be eligible, it's really worth reaching out to find out more about that. Unfortunately, that program did end third quarter of last year, but there are efforts at the federal level to try to reinstitute it because it really was a significant form of relief for nonprofits who are eligible. So just wanted to mention that, the ERTC, Employment Retention Tax Credit. So look into that if you think you might be eligible.
That's great. All right. So let's turn to 2022 and what you and your team are working on now, because as I mentioned at the top, when we started, the state of California is deep into budget negotiations, et cetera.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And you mentioned earlier our first ever joint hearing of the State Assembly and Senate Select Committees on the nonprofit sector. In the past, until last year, we had a select committee only on the Assembly side. And when then Assembly member Limon became a senator, she advocated for there to be a Senate select committee as well. So we are now fortunate to have a select committee on the Senate side chaired by Senator Limon, and a select committee on the Assembly side now chaired by Assembly member Luz Rivas. So they had their first ever joint hearing on February 17th. And Cal Nonprofits worked really closely with the chair's staff to select 8 panelists from around the state and representing a range of sectors within the nonprofit community to talk about what the pandemic has been like for their organizations and their communities, and also to propose remedies and policy solutions for ensuring that nonprofits can thrive during emergencies and make sure that their communities are doing okay. And one of the panelists was our CEO, Jan Masaoka. I wanted to make sure to mention that. And just to give the audience some ideas of what some of the key takeaways were from that hearing, I think it's important. So we know this as nonprofit leaders ourselves, but nonprofits continued to step up during the pandemic, as we always do during emergencies and all the time, to serve our communities and to respond to the changing needs. And one of the panelists pointed out, I thought this was really a great point, that some of the communities that nonprofits serve are always in crisis. And the pandemic just exacerbated that. So that was an important point that got raised. And then just some of the challenges. Certain parts of the sector are experiencing workforce shortages. So that was raised. And the need for nonprofits to be able to hire and retain quality staff so that they can continue to provide the services that Californians need. And one way to do that would be for contracts. This issue comes up again and will continue to come up as we talk, that contracts, government contracts, have enough money in them allocated to wages so that nonprofits can compete on the job market, frankly, so that we can, offer wages and benefits that are somewhat comparable to what are available in other industries. So that came up as an issue as well. And then other contracting issues also came up. The need for full reimbursement for administrative or indirect costs and like infrastructural costs, technology, accounting, all of the kind of back end things that nonprofits do to make those front end programs work. We need to be fully reimbursed for those costs. Another one was a lot of times with starting new programs in particular, when nonprofits get a contract to start a new program, they don't get paid on the contract for months. So they're having to subsidize the first few months of a program. One of the proposed remedies was some kind of advance or pre-start funding so that nonprofits aren't put in the position of subsidizing government-funded programs. That really doesn't make sense. And then the third one was just to ensure that delayed payments don't happen, that when nonprofits are submitting undisputed invoices, that there's prompt payments so that we're not having to foot the bill again while government gets around to paying us. So those were some of the issues that got raised. And they are issues that a coalition of nonprofits is now working on to address. So I'll say a little bit more about that. But let's jump into federal funding for a minute. Shall we do that? Did you have any questions?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So I'll move on from the hearing. I hope it's the first of many joint hearings. I'm sure it will be that we'll have to elevate the issues of nonprofits in Sacramento. We had other members of the committees participate, and as follow-up to the hearing, our legislative advocate in Sacramento, Jennifer Fearing, distributed a summary of the key points from the hearing to all of the legislators in the Capitol. So every senator and assembly member got a copy with a summary of all of the key points. So that brought great visibility to the sector. Okay, so now let's move on to some of the federal funding happenings. We know that the American Rescue Plan Act distributed, I think it was about $42 billion in California, to including state funding as well as city and county funding, one of the things that we've been involved in is supporting a cohort of nonprofits to increase their local advocacy skills around budget and ARPA so that they can make sure that nonprofits are at the table when there are decisions being made about how ARPA funds, and by ARPA I mean American Rescue Plan Act, how those funds are being used and distributed. We want to make sure that nonprofits are at the table at the local level. It's not something Cal Nonprofits can do, but we can support nonprofits around the state doing that at both the city and county level. So we have a cohort of organizations that are working with coaches that have more budget advocacy experience to help that cohort of organizations build their advocacy skills and for them to take on some activities, either at the city or county level, to engage with elected officials around ARPA and where that money's going, asking questions about are nonprofits part of the process in determining where the money goes, are nonprofits receiving money, are our communities going to be served by this federal funding? So that's happening. We've had one convening, I think probably the first convening in California of people who are doing ARPA advocacy so that we could exchange ideas with each other. And we hope to have another one this spring. So that's one thing that we are doing. Just moving to the state budget, I don't feel like this is a good time to comment on what's going to happen on the state budget and how it's going to impact the sector. There are a few budget asks that we are supporting. Again, because we represent the whole sector, we don't dive into specific budget asks that address unique subsector issues like the environment or housing, or we support those efforts, but we don't engage in them directly. But we are supporting a couple. And one that I wanted to mention is a health equity and racial justice budget ask that was in the budget last year and then got removed. That one would address a whole range of public health issues in partnerships between local public health departments and nonprofits. So it would bring some significant funding to a wide range of nonprofits. So we support that. They're asking for at least $100 million a year for these partnerships on the ground to address public health issues. The other one that we support is, I mentioned that there is now ombudsperson for student loan borrowers in California. That ombuds position came about as a result of an Assembly Bill 376, authored by Mark Stone. And we supported that bill. We were part of a coalition that supported that bill, a coalition of people who are advocating on behalf of better policies to protect student borrowers. And we're engaged in the student borrower issue because so many nonprofit employees it's just part of our workforce, a reality of our workforce. So it's part of our work to support the sector overall, the workforce overall.
And Lucy, could you share what the program consists of? If someone works in the public sector, can they reduce the amount of their student loan?
The public service loan forgiveness does offer opportunities for people who are working in public service. So that means at a nonprofit or a teacher. So it can be either through government or through a nonprofit job. If you work for 10 years and there are other requirements, you can have your loan forgiven. So that's a public service loan forgiveness program, and that's a federal program. The Ombuds program that is now in place as a result of that Assembly Bill 376, that's a state program, and it's located in the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, which is also a new department. They are available to serve student borrowers. So if you are concerned about how your loan is being serviced, you have a complaint about your servicer, you can reach out to the ombudsperson. They are also going to be doing proactive outreach about the federal program, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness, in the coming year. And they have asked for money from the state budget to be able to do that outreach and also sub-grant money to nonprofits to do that out. We are supporting that. They're asking for $10 million. We actually think that they should ask for more. So we may be supporting a higher amount because we want to make sure that people who are eligible for the public service loan forgiveness access it. And now the federal agency is actually forgiving people on the loans. It has been a really problematic program in the past under different administrations. I'll just put it that way, where there's been this promise of real forgiveness and then very few student borrowers have actually gotten their loans forgiven. So now people are actually getting their loans forgiven. And with the waiver, there are some particular exceptions that are happening so that some people who didn't qualify for forgiveness in the past are going to be able to have their loans forgiven. So it's really important to look into that, check out the website for the ombudsperson and access information about public service loan forgiveness to find out if, even if you didn't qualify in the past, you may qualify now under the waiver. So that's another thing that we are engaged in. I also was going to talk a little bit about the federal ACE Act. I know I'm going back and forth between federal and state, but I wanted to make sure to talk about the ACE Act. This is a federal bill. It first was introduced on the Senate side, and there's now a companion bill on the House side.
So to set this up, ACE, another acronym, could you explain what ACE stands for, and then you can dive into detail?
Yes, ACE stands for Accelerating Charitable Efforts. And the main goal of it is to address some problems in current policies with regard to donor-advised funds and payout by private foundations. And I'll dig in a little bit deeper just so you understand the problem a little bit more. Right now, when donors donate money and put it into a donor-advised fund, there are no rules about how long that money sits in that fund. And yet, donors get an immediate deduction for the donations they have made. So there's a loss in tax revenue up front. And the way tax deductions are supposed to work when you make a donation to a charity is that there's a corresponding benefit to society, right? The taxpayer gets a break. There's a loss in tax revenue, but there's a corresponding benefit because society benefits through the donation of that money to nonprofits who then serve our communities. So that's the way it should work, and that's the way tax policies were designed to work. But unfortunately, with the increased use of donor-advised funds in the past decade, and it just continues to escalate, policies haven't caught up with what's actually happening in the donor-advised fund. There are no restrictions. This money can sit there indefinitely. So you've got, on the one hand, the immediate loss of revenue, and on the other hand, no necessary immediate gain by society by getting those donations. So the ACE Act works to remedy that by having restrictions on how long money can sit in donor-advised funds. And there are exceptions to those restrictions. Donor-advised funds under $1 million can hold on to their money because we really do want to encourage people to build up their assets to a certain extent and then get that money out the door to charities and communities. So we wanted to make sure that smaller donor-advised funds can build up their assets first. But then also we recognize that there are different kinds of organizations sponsoring these donor-advised funds. On the one hand, there are the Fidelities and Schwabs of the world that are commercial investment companies that have a charity arm that oversees these donor-advised funds. They get fees for managing these funds. So they have a financial incentive to actually have the money stay in the funds. And then community foundations also use donor-advised funds as a vehicle. And community foundations are mission-driven, so they're quite different from commercial investment companies that sponsor these funds.
And so that would be community foundations for folks who are listening would be like the San Francisco Foundation, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, the East Bay Community Foundation.
Exactly. Those are great local examples. So there's also a carve out for certain donor-advised funds that are sponsored by community foundations. But the end goal is to make sure that money doesn't sit indefinitely in donor-advised funds. And then the other piece of the ACE Act is making sure that private foundations who are required to do a 5% payout annually, all of that payout, or as much of that payout as possible, is money going to charities. Right now, private foundations can count as part of their 5% payout money going to donor-advised funds. And remember, I just said that money going to a donor-advised funds can sit there forever. So that's not a real payout if it isn't getting to the charity right away, but is sitting in a donor-advised fund. So the ACE Act would not allow money that goes from a private foundation to a donor advised fund to count as part of that 5% payout. And it also has some restrictions around family member travel expenses and things like that counting as payout, because that's going right back to wealthy people who are funding the foundation, which is great. But really, if the whole point of the 5% payout is for the money to go to charities who are serving our communities. So that's the ACE Act, and we've been really proud to support it. And we don't know really what's going to happen with it in terms of moving forward, where there's so many items on the federal agenda right now, but we really feel, even though it's not perfect, it does get at that gap in current policies that keeps charities and communities from getting the money they need to help people who need it. So that's the ACE Act.
And so, Lucy, I know there was ACE Act. It's wonderful to see that they're finally dealing with these two big issues, because they've been really big issues for a while, especially DAF's pretty much a black box for nonprofits to actually try to reach out to someone who has a DAF, donor advised fund, that the folks managing it don't make it easy for anyone in the development department of a nonprofit to actually find out who the person is, how to approach them on a program, et cetera. So is there a mirror, if you will, or a state ACE Act in motion? Because I know Kat Taylor, for example, was really a couple years back working on trying to provide much more transparency on donor advised funds to force that money out of those funds and into the community.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue, George, to talking about some of our statewide efforts. With regard to donor advised fund reforms at the state level, we are in a bit of a wait and see mode right now, because we want to see what happens at the federal level. We've been really closely monitoring what's happening with the ACE Act, and we know that will have an impact on what happens at the state level. But we are firmly committed to state reforms as well that address this transparency issue that you're mentioning, and that also address the concerns about inactive funds, so money sitting in DAFs and not being moved to charities. We don't have a bill right now. We're still in conversation with Assemblymember Wicks about timing, and we want to make sure that our timing is good on this. So for right now, we're in hold mode on that, but we haven't given up on it by any means. So I just wanted to make sure that listeners are clear about that. Oh, there was one more federal bill that I wanted to mention before we move into state stuff.
The Nonprofit Sector Strength and Partnership Act.
Exactly. Now, this one hasn't been introduced, so your listeners are getting a preview of something that hasn't even become official yet. But there are hundreds of nonprofits at the national level who are organizing it, and independent sector is one of the who are supporting it. I'm sorry, and independent sector is one of the lead organizations supporting the act. But they and the National Council of Nonprofits are both national organizations that represent our sector and our member organizations. So have associations like Cal Nonprofits as part of their membership. And what this act will do, and it's still being fine-tuned before introduction, and I'm sure will be fine-tuned even further after it's introduced, but it would provide a White House office on the nonprofit sector partnership. So there would be a place in the White House that was really focused on partnerships with the nonprofit sector. There would be a federal advisory board made up of nonprofit that would advise policies and how they impact the nonprofit sector. It would require quarterly economic data on the nonprofit sector. That data already exists for other industries, but not for our sector. It would be great to have that data to use for advocacy. It would also include other kinds of more technical things like reduction in paperwork for nonprofits who want to fundraise in multiple states. So we're in wait and see mode on that. Cal Nonprofits is going to support it, but I can share updates on that with you once we know.
And the timing on that, you think, is sometime in this next quarter, like the third quarter of 2022?
Yes, we have heard that it may be introduced as early as April.
That's great. I wanted to turn to you've been at this for a while, and from your perspective, and I think for the audience members, that's why I really wanted to bring you back, and Cal Nonprofits working on the statewide basis. What do you feel are some of the biggest impacts that Cal Nonprofits policy and legislative work have had on our nonprofit sector, and then obviously in turn our communities?
Okay, I'll give you a couple of examples, and I think the larger point is that we are just ideally positioned to initiate and respond to policies that impact our sector as a whole, and to do that work at the state and then to a lesser degree at the federal level with our national partners. One example that I'd like to give is that we are organizing a statewide contracting coalition to address some of the contract issues that I mentioned before. And this is a growing group of nonprofits. And we are working on a sign-on letter that will go to the administration, the governor's office, listing some of the challenges we face as nonprofits, and then suggesting remedies for those challenges, some policy improvements to address them. So that's an example of a role that we play, a critical role that we play to bring nonprofits together from a range of subsectors to work together on something that affects the sector as a whole. So that's one way in which we have a really critical impact. And we're supporting, just want to mention a bill that we're supporting. We're not the sponsors on it, but Senate Bill 1069 it wants to address the indirect cost reimbursement issue that I raised before. So that's an UMBERG bill. So watch for that one if you're interested. So that's one thing. I mean, during the pandemic, thousands of nonprofits got grants through the California Small Business COVID-19 Relief Grant program. So that totaled millions and millions of dollars. So we just really can't underestimate the importance of these kinds of public relief programs. And Cal Nonprofits was right at the table from the beginning, making sure that nonprofits were included in that program. I think those are two examples that highlight the bigger role that we play in a range of issues of bringing the sector together and advocating on behalf of the sector and being responsive when there are opportunities, policy opportunities. So I'm trying to think of the only other thing I wanted to mention really quickly, and I don't know if we're running out of time, but because of the fact that Cal Nonprofits is known and that our leader, CEO Jen Masaoka, is known nationally as well as at the state level, we have opportunities come to us. We recently filed an amicus brief on a U.S. Supreme Court case because some national legal scholars asked for us to do it and knew that it was something that we would be able to work with them on and be able to take leadership at the national level on that. And I won't go into the details about that, but the case was Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Attorney General Bonta. So that's an example of being positioned in a way that allows us to take advantage of opportunities to advocate on behalf of this.
And Lucy, let me turn to my next question, and that is for folks who are listening to the show, how can they support your work?
Okay. We would love to have your support. You can learn about what is happening by getting on our mailing list. We'd love to have you join our mailing list, and you can do that by getting onto our website at calnonprofits.org. You can also attend one of the webinars that I mentioned before, either on a compliance topic or policy topics. That's a way to find out what is happening currently in the sector and what we're doing about it. You can become a member. We are a member organization, and we count on our members to do the advocacy with us. We need member voices. We're a small organization that represents a lot of other organizations. And we really rely on members and membership dues, frankly, to support the work that we do. So that's another piece. You can sign on to support our efforts when we ask you to do that. So through our e-alerts, we'll, if we have a letter that we need sign-on organizations to join, we will say, here's a great opportunity for you to weigh in, and it doesn't take much time. We need maybe the name of your organization and your logo, something like that. So it's a very easy way to be engaged in advocacy, even if you don't have a lot of time and capacity to do. And then you can also reach out to me if you have questions about the policy work that we're doing. And I'm at lucyc@calnonprofits.org. So really encourage your listeners to reach out if you have questions, or if you know about policy issues that you think we need to be on top of. And then just in terms of other ways that nonprofits can do advocacy themselves, joining coalitions like Cal Nonprofits, but also local coalitions like for human services organizations in San Francisco, you have your wonderful Human Services Network. So being part of those coalitions allows you to get information quickly without having to do all your own research, and you can be engaged that way in actions. And then I always like to encourage nonprofit leaders to set up meetings with your local legislator, the staff of your local legislators. Give the district offices a call and talk to them about your organization and the challenges that your communities are facing.
Thank you. Those are all. The next question is going to be a hard one only because you've been there doing this for a while. But could you share with the audience perhaps one of your favorite stories of something coming from an idea or policy that the whole Cal Nonprofits team worked through, and then on the other side, it became legislation and its impact?
Well, I've really already talked about it in a way. I think Assembly Bill 488 and that David and Goliath story that I told you, it was personally very satisfying to be able to get great regulations in place that are going to help our donors and help us as charities so that we can help our communities. So that was really satisfying. And to have the opportunity to be at the table with some very large, very big players, let's say, and come up with something that worked for everybody and in particular supported our sector. And of course, it's always a pleasure to work with our Attorney General partners, the great staff there. So I would say that is a real highlight and will have a significant impact on everybody who uses online charitable platforms, which is most of us. So that's very satisfying. And then also the ongoing work around the contracting. There's building momentum in that area. So that is really satisfying. It's been an issue that precedes the pandemic and yet has gained momentum as a result of the pandemic. And so I think I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to make some real changes in that area soon.
Yeah, that one sounds like another kind of paradigm shift where nonprofits who barely can keep it all going don't have to front load by using their own resources before the typical 45, 90 days of getting paid from a contract from a government.
Absolutely. We've got to do something about that. It just really, and the part of the problem is that nonprofits really want to provide these services, but they're turning down contracts because they can't provide the upfront money to fund them. And that's bad for the government because the government counts on nonprofits to provide these services. And it's bad for our communities because we know our communities need them.
Exactly. All right, I'm going to turn to my final question, which is, what do you feel are some of the positive things that come out of the pandemic and this crisis to support your policy and legislative work with both the California legislature and nonprofits?
One thing is the greater awareness of the critical role that nonprofits play as service providers, employers, and economic drivers. We employ more than 1.2 million Californians. We're the fourth largest employer by sector in the state. We provide and generate 15% of the state gross product. And I think people are realizing that more and more as a result of the pandemic. I was recently looking at an article that said that nonprofit community health clinics provided vaccinations to at least 6 million low-income residents. So that's just an example. We provide 32% of Medi-Cal services. And we've got that data, but I think that part of what the pandemic has done has just brought more visibility to the sector overall. And then another thing is that nonprofits want to be more engaged in advocacy as a result of the pandemic. I think because they're hearing about CARES Act funding, they're hearing about ARPA funding, and they want to find out whether that money is going to come to our communities. We want to know, are we going to get a piece of that? And we know that in order for that to happen, we're going to have to be at the table. So I think there's an increased interest in involvement in advocacy, even for organizations that provide direct services and haven't been very involved in advocacy in the past. And then the third one I wanted to mention, because we care so much about civic engagement and a strong democracy, is that because we have had to operate remotely, democratic processes have also had to operate remotely. And there's been an increased access as a result to people being able to participate in state public hearings if they can't travel to Sacramento. In the past, they weren't able to testify in a hearing, but now you can get on the phone or on Zoom and be part of a hearing. So I hope that aspect really continues because it allows many more people generally and nonprofit leaders in particular to be able to be part of state advocacy and influence what's happening at the state level.
Great. All right. So anything else I haven't asked you that you wanted to cover that we haven't covered?
The only thing I would encourage listeners to do is access our Causes Count publication that's on our website. It's got a lot of great data that you can use in your own advocacy. So I encourage you to look at that. I quoted some of the data today, but there's a lot more that's really useful for pointing out to your local electeds why nonprofits are important and all the amazing work we're doing. I think that's it, but I really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to you, George.
And thank you, Lucy, for sharing your wonderful work and insights into the policy and legislative efforts to support both our nonprofits and communities. We'll make sure that listeners have your contact information, website, and social media, along with links to all of your great resources so they can get engaged with Cal Nonprofits and to support your work. Please stay safe and healthy as we all work our way through this latest stage of COVID-19's pandemic and all of its variants.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voice of Lucy Salcido-Carter, the Public Policy Director at Cal Nonprofits. To become a member and make a donation to support the work of Cal Nonprofits, please go to calnonprofits.org. To get more insights into the most detailed study produced on COVID-19's impact on our nonprofit sector, both nationally and by state, please listen back to episode 34 and our interview with Jacob Harold and Anna Koob of Candid. And to get even more background about all the work Cal Nonprofits is doing to support our nonprofit organizations in our communities statewide, please listen back to episode 61 in our interview with Christina Dragonetti and Lucy Salcido-Carter.
We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. Today's episode was made possible by the audio wizard and our associate producer, Eric Estrada, and the graphics magic of Casey Nance from Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is supported by a grant from the James Irvine Foundation, dedicated to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. More at irvine.org. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.